Oh hi, I didn't see you there. I'm Philbert D, and just like John Cena, you can't see me. This is Phil on Films. This week, we're reviewing Nuuk, Cara x Jagger, and Doctor Sleep. Alice Dixon is Eliza, a widow living alone in Nuuk, Greenland. She meets Mark, played by Agamulak, a fellow Filipino who helps her out with a couple of things. Over time, the two form a friendship that's veering towards something romantic. At around the same time, Eliza's estranged teenage son Carl returns home, having apparently failed to make a life in Copenhagen. He's got a lot of anger in him, and he's spending every night getting drunk. Within these relationships, there are secrets waiting to be revealed. So yeah, about those secrets. For the longest time in this film, nothing actually happens. Like, very little of note happens to these characters because it's holding back a reveal. There's a lot of stuff in the third act that recontextualizes a lot of what happens, casting a shadow over events that seemed innocuous and like mundane. The problem with that approach is that we went through all those sequences and they were all very innocuous and mundane, and having the context change in the end doesn't actually make those sequences any more enjoyable. It just means that we sat through 2/3 of a movie that was really boring, and then a third of the movie where suddenly we're told that stuff wasn't actually boring. It's a kind of clever structuring that actually really bothers me. It feels like a story that was written backwards. The story built around a twist that isn't actually that interesting, and if you try to piece things together, it doesn't actually make sense. There are just so many elements in this movie that don't really add up given what we learn in the end, which is a real shame because that was the whole point of this thing. Putting the structure aside, this movie is just like not very good. I think it really suffers from a bad lead performance. Alice Dixon never really finds a core to this character. It all just feels like external shallowness. The film is supposed to follow her journey, but we never really get to the crux of anything. She ends up feeling like a passenger to the whole thing. I think this film is really intending to be clever. It never really gets there. It's not as smart as it thinks it is, and it just becomes a tedious thing to watch. 1.5 stars. Jasmine Curtis Smith is the titular Cara. She has hyperthymesia, a condition that gives her the ability to recall her memories to a near-perfect degree. She treats this as a curse, however, as it's preventing her from moving on from her previous relationship. She's planning to go abroad to get treatment for her condition when she's suddenly called to help out her ex. It turns out that Jagger, played by Ruru Madrid, got into an accident and lost his memories. Cara agrees to help him relive some of their memories together, and that process proves to be emotionally difficult for the both of them. It's really hard to buy into this premise, which just involves a lot of contrivance. First off, you have a main character with a very rare condition. The film itself points out that only 61 people have ever been diagnosed with hyperthymesia, which makes it pretty difficult to relate to the main character. Then you compound that with the contrivance of an ex who got amnesia, and then to get them together, you have her intercepted as she's going to the airport to fly off to Germany so that she can get treatment, so that she can erase her painful memories of the said ex. And then the movie has them revisiting like important places in their relationship, even though she's already at a point where she was already like going to take the drastic step of erasing her memories. There's a lot of like weird extra baggage to this movie that never turns into something that the audience can connect to. At the same time, the film is weirdly mundane. You have this character with this really interesting condition, and the problem is just about her inability to move on from a relationship, which is really, really uninteresting because you don't need to have hyperthymesia to have difficulty moving on from a relationship. They're making it out like her condition is special, but we don't see anything particularly exceptional about the way she processes these memories. Sure, she may have perfect recall, but our imperfect memories are still capable of generating the same level of emotional hurt, even if our memories are fuzzier. The film doesn't really make it clear how much more she's suffering because of her perfect recall. Putting all that conceptual stuff aside, it just feels very awkward. The whole movie never really generates the kind of romance you want from these kinds of films. There's not much chemistry between Ruru Madrid and Jasmine Curtis Smith. You never really feel any real heat between them. And that's an issue because the story isn't helping them out. As we learn more about the relationship, the film makes a pretty good case for them not being together. And presumably, we should want them to end up together. This just never really builds into anything that's worth rooting for. 2 stars.
When I was a kid, there was a place. A dark place. They closed it down and let it rot. But the things that lived there,
Ewan McGregor plays a grown-up Danny Torrance. Since the events of The Shining, he's been trying to hide his special talents, suppressing them with his drinking. The movie picks up with him moving to a small town in New Hampshire and getting sober. Just when he thinks he's found some peace, a teenage girl with the same powers as him reaches out, asking him to help fight off a group of mysterious beings that feed off the essences of people who possess The Shining. First off, it should probably be said that if you haven't seen The Shining, you probably shouldn't see this film either. You should go see The Shining first because this story doesn't work, I think, without a working knowledge of what happened in The Shining. It really doesn't try to explain that plot anymore, and it just functions as if the audience already knows what happened before, which is interesting. There are direct homages to sequences in the original movie, like literal echoes of what's happened before, and that stuff will be more enjoyable if The Shining is fresh in your mind. Now, having said that, this film is actually not at all like the Kubrick film. The Shining is a very strange movie. It's very isolated. It's almost plotless up to a certain point. The second half of that movie is basically just a series of horror images that almost work without the context. It's just a translation of everything that's like messed up in the world. This film has a lot more on its mind. It's much more expansive. There's a world that it builds. There's a lore that it explores. There's actually a ton of exposition here and a lot of explaining about how things work. At a certain point, it kind of becomes a superhero movie, which is an interesting tack to take. I will also say that this isn't a horror movie in the way that we understand it now, which is mostly the kind of thing where, things jump out of the shadows and you get startled for a little bit, and then we move on to the next sequence where something jumps out of the shadows. There's some of that in here, but really, the film finds its horror in just terrible people doing terrible things. There's a very disturbing sequence in the middle of this film that is more horrific than anything The Conjuring has ever shown us, because it feels real even though there's weird magic involved. And I like that. I like that the horror of this film is much more rooted in something tangible, that it's working on a level that does justice to its roots. Mike Flanagan is an excellent director. He finds lots of clever little ways to visualize a lot of the weirdness that's in Stephen King's book. And he's also very judicious about what he adapts. He actually changes quite a bit in the story. There are some things that he excised and some major thematic differences based on certain characters appearing. I won't get into it, but yeah, I think he makes some real smart choices in this movie. The performances are really good. Ewan McGregor is amazing, and Rebecca Ferguson is just a joy to watch. She's having the most fun of anybody in this film, and those two performances basically carry this whole thing. It makes all that explaining kind of bearable. Having said that, yeah, this is a long movie, and a lot of it is just people explaining things about how psychic powers work, basically. And that might not be what you wanted to get into. Maybe you just wanted more things to pop out of the shadows. Maybe you wanted them to get to the Overlook Hotel right away. And if you go into this movie expecting that, it's not gonna be great. But it's a really interesting movie that makes some bold choices. And even though it's really beholden to The Shining, it's its own kind of thing. And by the end of it, it comes out pretty fun. It's a fun, little, weird horror movie. 4 stars. Thanks for joining us. Once again, I'm reminding everybody that Cinema One kicks off this week, and that's 9 new local films and a bunch of like international films that you probably want to see if you're any sort of cinephile. Until then, you should just like and subscribe, or maybe dislike if you didn't like any of this, or leave a comment or ask a question, and do all the internet things. And until next time, goodbye internet, fight your own drug war, Duterte.